The police lights flashed through my kitchen window as I stood barefoot with a coffee mug in hand, still trying to figure out how a pond I didn't even have had turned my peaceful life into a legal circus, all thanks to the HOA president, Karen, who swore I was harboring a swamp full of mosquitoes, frogs, and alligators. Asterisk, I moved out to the countryside for peace. Not fake peace, the kind where neighbors wave but secretly watch your every move, but real, honest, wide-open peace. The kind where you could sit on your porch and only hear birds, not sirens. That dream led me to a small 5-acre lot just outside town. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. A 2-bedroom fixer-upper, a leaning red barn, and a gentle slope of land where wildflowers bloomed when it rained. The dip at the back of the yard would sometimes fill up with rainwater for a day or two, forming a shallow puddle. Then the sun would come out and dry it back into cracked earth. I never gave it a second thought. It was just part of the land's character. But that dip, as innocent as it seemed, would soon turn my life into a ridiculous legal soap opera, thanks to one woman, Karen. I first saw Karen 3 weeks after I moved in. She was standing across the street from my mailbox, hands on her hips, eyes squinting at my property like she was inspecting a crime scene. I gave her a polite wave, and she responded with a stiff nod before strutting off. At the time, I just assumed she was one of those neighbors who like things just so. I didn't know she was the president of the HOA that technically didn't even govern my property. My house was right on the boundary line, and I had bought it specifically because it wasn't under HOA control. But Karen had other ideas. A week later, I came home to find a note taped to my front door in a sheet protector, complete with the HOA letterhead and 3 separate font colors. It read, "Notice of violation, unpermitted farm pond drain, immediately." I blinked at the paper, walked round back, and looked at the pond. It wasn't even there. Just dirt, dry grass, and a couple of birds picking at bugs. No water, no frogs, no nothing. Confused, I called the number listed at the bottom. Karen picked up. She sounded like she had been waiting for the call all day. "Yes, we've received multiple complaints about your pond," she said, as if stating the weather. "You need a permit to have open water like that. It's a mosquito risk, a hazard, and it lowers neighborhood value." I told her, as calmly as I could, that I didn't have a pond. I explained how it was just a dip in the land that collected rain occasionally. She didn't care. "Intent doesn't matter," she said sharply. "You're responsible for what's on your land." I told her my land wasn't part of the HOA, and she responded, "We'll see about that." That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time conversation. A few days later, she came by in person, walking the edge of my lawn in tall rubber boots and snapping photos with a tablet. I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, not sure whether to laugh or ask her to leave. When I finally stepped down to talk to her, she pulled out a clipboard. "We're documenting this," she said. "This is a clear violation. The runoff from this pond is affecting nearby properties." I looked at where she was pointing. "A patch of weeds, you mean the ground?" I asked, "because there's no water here." She gave me a tight-lipped smile and walked off like she'd just won something. A week after that, a letter came in the mail certifying Karen and the HOA had filed an official complaint with the county. The wording was laughable: unauthorized aquatic feature, wildlife attraction concerns, and my personal favorite, unlicensed water body. I sent them pictures of the backyard, dry, dusty, and very much not a pond. I even went out with a ruler and took measurements. 0 inches of water. Still they pressed forward. Karen claimed in a follow-up letter that I was manipulating the environment to hide the pond, like I was some kind of wizard draining water with a magic spell. She included photos of an actual pond, which I recognized immediately as belonging to a property about 3 streets over. It even had a dock and cattails, clearly not mine. I replied, pointing this out, and warned her that if this didn't stop, I would consider legal action for harassment. The next day she came by again. This time I was planting tomato seedlings in the garden when she marched up with a printed copy of the HOA bylaws as if it was the Constitution. "These apply to everyone in this neighborhood," she said firmly. "This community has standards." I stood up, wiping dirt off my hands, and told her plainly that I had no pond. I didn't report to the HOA, and I wasn't going to drain dry land just to satisfy her weird obsession. She looked at me with this half-horrified stare and muttered something about people like me ruining neighborhoods. I shrugged. "You're welcome to come by after it rains and take all the puddle photos you want," I said. "Just don't trespass." She stormed off again, this time warning me that legal consequences were coming. I didn't know at the time, but she wasn't bluffing. 2 weeks later, I received a lawsuit. She'd officially sued me over a puddle that didn't exist. The papers used the same phrases from her notes: hazardous pond, environmental threat, and intentional not to come. I stood in my kitchen reading it over and over, stunned. My dog looked up at me like he was asking if we were moving again. I wasn't angry, at first just baffled. Surely no judge would take this seriously, right? But I also knew, from the look in Karen's eyes and the way she'd marched up my driveway like a soldier on a mission, that this wasn't going to end easily. Something in her had decided I was the enemy, and she wasn't going to stop until she either won or humiliated herself trying. I'll never forget the moment I opened the envelope and saw the county court seal at the top of the page. That sinking feeling in your chest when you realize someone has taken their petty obsession way too far. Karen had really done it. She filed a lawsuit against me for maintaining an unregulated farm pond, citing environmental dangers, neighborhood value concerns, and a laundry list of HOA rules that didn't even apply to my property. But what truly made me pause wasn't just the absurdity of the claim, it was the photos attached. Big, glossy, full-color prints of a large pond with lily pads, ducks, a broken-down dock, and a rusted chair on the bank. I recognized that pond instantly. It belonged to an older couple named the Holts, who lived 3 streets over, tucked behind a grove of trees, with a real pond they'd had for decades. Karen had clearly walked over there, snapped some pictures, and passed them, off as proof of my environmental violation. The ridiculousness of it all made my hands shake, not with fear, but with disbelief. I wasn't worried about losing in court. What worried me was how far Karen was willing to go. She had crossed a line from nosy neighbor to someone who fabricated evidence to get her way. I immediately contacted a lawyer, a nonsense local guy named Mark who'd been dealing with HOA nonsense for years. I walked into his office with a folder full of my own photos, dry yard, weather reports showing weeks of no rain, and time-stamped videos showing the exact spot she claimed was a pond. Mark looked through everything with a growing smirk. "Well," he said, tapping one of the glossy prints Karen had submitted, "either your property teleported across the street or someone's taking creative liberties." He agreed to take the case, confident it would be dismissed quickly. Still, the stress didn't go away. It's one thing to have a weird neighbor complain about your lawn. It's another to stand in a courtroom defending yourself against lies. But while we waited for the court date, Karen wasn't done. She started coming by more frequently, always with her tablet in hand, always pretending to take notes. One afternoon, she actually brought 2 other HOA board members with her, neither of whom had ever spoken to me before. They stood at the edge of my yard like a trio of detectives, pointing at the low spot in the grass and nodding as if they were uncovering buried treasure. I walked out calmly, phone recording in my hand, and asked them if they were lost. Karen answered in her usual clipped tone. "We're conducting a community site evaluation," she said, like this was a mission from NASA. I told them they had 10 seconds to leave before I called the sheriff for trespassing. One of the other board members, an older man in a polo shirt, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Karen," he muttered, tugging at her sleeve. "This might not be the right approach." But Karen wouldn't budge. "He thinks this is a joke," she hissed. "He's breaking the rules." I laughed under my breath and went back inside. They left a few minutes later, but Karen gave me a look that made it clear this wasn't over. Then came the letters. Not legal ones. Handwritten notes slipped into my mailbox, each angrier than the last. One said, "Water ruins more than wood, it drowns reputations." Another read, "Your lies will be exposed. We're watching." It was signed "Only Concerned Neighbors." I knew exactly who sent them. It was theatrical, like something out of a bad mystery novel. But it also made me realize something important. Karen wasn't just trying to prove a point. She was trying to wear me down mentally, emotionally, financially. She thought that if she harassed me enough, I'd just give in, dig up my yard, or leave altogether. But I wasn't going anywhere to stay ahead of the madness. I started documenting everything, every encounter, every note, every time she stepped onto my property. I installed a trail camera at the back of the house facing the yard, and I kept a daily log with photos showing the exact state of the so-called pond. I even joked with friends that I was going to start charging admission to the invisible lake. One rainy day, when water actually did collect in the dip for a few hours, I filmed a short clip pretending to fish, complete with a stick and a piece of string. I posted it on my private Facebook, just to lighten the mood. Somehow, Karen found it. That's when things escalated. The very next day, I saw her standing at the edge of the road again, arms crossed, glaring at the spot where I'd filmed my joke. Then, to my disbelief, she raised her phone and started talking into it loud, enough for me to hear through the open window. "Yes, I'm here now. The pond is clearly visible. He's violating the order. Yes, it's back." I watched as she nodded and gave my address. My stomach dropped. Was she really calling the police over this? I stepped outside just as she ended the call. "You called 911, I asked, still holding a sandwich in one hand. "Yes," she snapped. "You mocked this process. This is an environmental and legal concern." I just looked at her and started laughing. It wasn't even a loud laugh, just a quiet, disbelieving chuckle at the pure absurdity of it all. And that's when she lost it. Her face turned red. She pointed at me with her fingers shaking, and she shouted, "You won't be laughing when the police come, and they see what you've done." I raised an eyebrow and pointed toward the yard. "Karen," I said, "look at it. Where's the pond? Go on, show me." She opened her mouth, closed it again, and turned away. A few minutes later, I saw the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser pulling into my driveway. The sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly down my gravel driveway, tires crunching as if even the earth itself was exhausted from this nonsense. I stood there motionless, sandwich in hand, while Karen paced nearby like she was directing a Hollywood crime scene. She was already talking before the deputy even stepped out, arms flailing, voice high and tight like a violin string about to snap. Officer, officer. He's maintaining an unpermitted body of water and violating environmental safety regulations. It's back there, she shrieked, pointing so aggressively I thought her finger might fly off. The sheriff, a tall, sunburned man in his early 50s with mirrored sunglasses and a badge that glinted like it had seen too much small-town drama, stepped out slowly. He glanced at me, then at her, then at the yard. He didn't say a word at first, just took a deep breath, and adjusted his belt like he was trying to summon patience from another dimension. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I need you to calm down and explain what's going on." Karen wasted no time. She started rambling about puddles, wildlife, HOA codes, mosquito-borne illnesses, property values, and how I had publicly mocked her authority on the internet. I waited until she finished, then gave a polite nod. "Would you like to see the pond?" I asked the officer. He looked at me cautiously, then shrugged. "Sure." I led him around back to the infamous low spot, the area Karen had been obsessing over for weeks. It had rained slightly the night before, so there was maybe half an inch of standing water in a patch no wider than a kiddie pool. Even calling it a puddle felt generous. The sheriff stared at it, hands on his hips, lips pressed tight. "This is what all the fuss is about?" he asked. I nodded. "Apparently it's threatening national security," he snorted. "Just a small one, but I caught it." Karen, who had followed us, was practically vibrating. "That wasn't there yesterday," she said, furious. "He's manipulating the water levels to avoid detection." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you saying he's hiding water?" Karen nodded without hesitation. "Yes, he's draining it secretly, or covering it somehow." The sheriff looked at me. I shrugged. "Guess I'm a waterbender now." That got another half snort from him, and he cleared his throat like he was trying to stay professional. "Look," he said, addressing Karen now, "this doesn't appear to be a pond. It's just a natural depression in the ground. Temporary water from rainfall is not a crime, and he's not in violation of anything that I can see." Face twisted. "What about the environmental codes, the HOA rules?" The sheriff gave her a steady look. "HOA rules aren't criminal law, ma'am. You can't call 911 for civil disputes unless someone's in danger or breaking the law." She opened her mouth to argue again, but he held up a hand. "Also, this property is outside the HOA's boundary lines. You don't have legal authority here." It was like watching a balloon deflate in slow motion. Her posture slumped. Her mouth opened and closed like she was choking on her own indignation. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "You think this is funny, don't you?" I looked down at the tiny puddle and back at her. "It's kind of hard not to." The sheriff pulled out a small notepad and jotted something down. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "I'm going to write up a report that you filed a complaint with emergency services. That's a misuse of 911. Her jaw dropped. "Are you saying I'm in trouble?" He didn't answer. He just wrote, calm and steady. Karen stormed off without another word, red-faced and trembling. She practically sprinted to her car and sped off, tires kicking up gravel. After she left, the sheriff lingered for a moment. "This happened a lot?" he asked. I told him the whole story, the lawsuit, the fake photos, the notes in the mailbox, and how she dragged other HOA board members into her crusade. He shook his head slowly. "We get our fair share of Karens around here," he said, "but this one's writing a whole book." I offered him a bottle of water before he left, and he chuckled. "As long as it's not from your pond." With that, he climbed back into his cruiser and left. Peace once again returning to my sun-dappled backyard. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sky turn a soft orange behind the trees. The puddle had already started to dry up, leaving nothing behind but a damp patch of soil and a few confused flies. I realized that while Karen's attack hadn't physically hurt me, it had stolen something important. My peace, my dream of quiet, rural life had been hijacked by a control-obsessed neighbor with too much time and not enough boundaries. But after that day, I also realized something else. She had overplayed her hand. The sheriff saw the truth. The photos were fake. Her claims were falling apart, and the more she pushed, the more ridiculous she looked, not just to me, but to everyone. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I documented everything. I saved every note, backed up every video, printed screenshots, and added timestamps. If this ever went to court, and I had a feeling it would, I wanted to be over-prepared. My lawyer Mark was thrilled when I told him about the 911 call and the sheriff's report. "That's gold," he said. "Shows a pattern of harassment and false reporting. Judges hate that." I just nodded, more tired than angry. What baffled me the most wasn't the legal part. It was the mindset. How could someone convince themselves that a dry patch of grass was a full-blown environmental threat? How could they lie to the police with a straight face? And how far would Karen go to protect her fantasy of control? The days passed quietly after that. Karen didn't return right away. No more 911 calls. No more pacing at the end of the driveway. But I knew it wasn't over. People like her don't back down, they regroup. And I was right. A few days later, I received another certified letter, this time from a different attorney representing the HOA. It was longer, more formal, and even more absurd than the last one. They now claimed that my property was creating ecological instability and violating community integrity. They also included new photos, heavily zoomed-in shots of muddy grass. As if that somehow proved their case. I couldn't help but laugh. She really thought this was going to work. But what she didn't know was that the more she pushed, the more ammunition she was handing me. This wasn't just a feud anymore, it was a full-blown case of neighbor harassment, and I was going to see it through to the end, one dry blade of grass at a time. The morning of the court date arrived with gray clouds hanging low, like the sky itself was tired of Karen's nonsense. I didn't dress fancy, just a clean shirt, jeans, and my well-worn boots. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just there to tell the truth. My lawyer Mark had reviewed every piece of evidence I had, timestamps, video logs, weather reports, sheriff's statements, and a side-by-side photo comparison showing that the pond in Karen's original complaint wasn't even on my property. If facts were bricks, I had built a fortress. Still, walking into the courthouse gave me that weird feeling, nervous but confident, like when you know your team's going to win but the ref could still throw a surprise call. Karen, on the other hand, walked in like she owned the building. She wore a business suit 2 sizes too stiff for her posture and carried a thick binder stacked with papers, tabs, and post-it notes. You'd think she was prosecuting a corporate crime, not chasing a puddle ghost. She didn't look at me as she passed, but I caught the way she tilted her chin up like a swan on a mission. The courtroom wasn't full, just the judge, the clerk, my lawyer, me, Karen, her HOA attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a few scattered spectators who probably just wanted to see something crazy before lunch. The judge, a calm-looking woman with silver glasses and a firm voice, called us forward. Karen's lawyer went first. He gave a rehearsed speech about community standards, environmental safety, the sacred importance of HOA rules, and how my unauthorized aquatic feature was allegedly breeding pests, threatening property values, and disrespecting the shared vision of the neighborhood. I almost laughed when he said, aquatic feature. It sounded like I had a koi pond and a waterfall instead of a low patch of mud that couldn't even keep a worm interested. Then came Karen. The moment she stood up, you could feel the courtroom shift. Her voice was high and shaky but packed with drama. Your Honor, I have lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, she began, like it was a royal lineage. I have always upheld the standards of our community. When I saw the pond begin to form behind the defendant's home, I took it as my duty to act. She handed the judge a color-printed stack of photos, many of which were the same ones I'd already proven were from a different property. She even brought a printed map with a hand-drawn circle labeled Pond of Concern. I leaned over to Mark and whispered. She named it. He nodded without blinking. We're in for a show. Karen spoke for nearly 15 minutes, rambling about her role as HOA president, the alleged environmental risks, her emotional distress, and even referenced how I had mocked the situation online. She said my joke video where I fake fished in the puddle was proof of guilt and disregard for civil order. When she finally sat down, she looked proud, like she'd just exposed some grand conspiracy. The judge glanced over her glasses and turned to Mark. Your response, please. Mark stood, calm as a lake. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by stating the obvious. There is no pond. There never was a pond. There is a shallow indentation in the ground that sometimes collects rainwater briefly before drying up in the sun. This is natural and common across rural properties. He then handed over our folder of evidence, time-stamped photos showing dry ground, with a record showing drought-level rainfall, a printed copy of the sheriff's report confirming no violations, and a side-by-side comparison proving that Karen's photos were not taken on my land. Mark explained how Karen had harassed me for months, sent anonymous letters, and even misused 911 to escalate her campaign. He showed how I was not even a member of the HOA and therefore not subject to its rules. What we have here, he said, plainly, is a case of personal obsession being disguised as community concern. The judge listened quietly, flipping through the documents. Then came the part I didn't expect. The judge turned to Karen and asked, where were these photos taken? Karen hesitated. Behind his property, she said, not so confidently now. The judge raised an eyebrow. The timestamp says 11:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. The defendant was at work at that time, and the sheriff's office confirms he wasn't present. How did you access the backyard? Karen blinked. I was walking by from the road. The backyard is fenced, the judge said. So you climbed over or entered uninvited? Karen stammered. I was performing an HOA inspection on a property outside your jurisdiction. The judge cut in. Silence followed. Karen shrank into her seat, suddenly realizing how this sounded out loud in a courtroom. The judge looked at both attorneys and then gave her verdict. This case has no merit. The court sees no evidence of a maintained pond or violation of any environmental code. Furthermore, the court is concerned about the behavior of the plaintiff, including potentially misleading evidence, trespassing, and misuse of emergency services. Karen's jaw dropped. "But Your Honor," she began. But the judge wasn't done. "I strongly suggest, Ms. Reynolds, that you reconsider your methods of community leadership. This court will not entertain future claims based on speculation or misrepresentation." Karen's lawyer looked like he aged 5 years in those 30 seconds. The judge then turned to me. "Mr. Blake, you are free to go. Your request for reimbursement of legal fees is granted. Thank you for your documentation and patience." I nodded, half relieved, half stunned. We walked out of that courtroom with the weight of 3 months of nonsense lifted off my shoulders. Karen didn't follow. She stayed seated, staring straight ahead like her programming had frozen. Her fantasy had crumbled, and there was no one left to believe it but her. Outside, Mark shook my hand and grinned. "That," he said, "was one of the strangest HOA cases I've ever seen." I laughed. "Guess I'll need to post a no lifeguard on duty sign over the puddle now." He chuckled. "Make it a tourist spot." As I walked back to my truck, the clouds began to break, letting in a soft golden light. I took one last glance toward the courthouse and thought about everything I'd been through, how something so small could spiral so far when pride, control, and obsession get tangled together. After the courtroom dust settled and the nonsense was tossed out like it always should have been, you'd think that would be the end of it. You'd think Karen would finally step back, lick her wounds, and move on to measuring the height of her neighbor's grass instead of chasing imaginary ponds. But people like Karen don't give up that easily. She didn't say a word to me on the way out of the courthouse, but her silence felt more dangerous than all the yelling she'd done over the past few months. It wasn't defeat, it was pause, like she was already planning her next angle. I returned home that evening, exhausted but weirdly energized. Like I'd finished a marathon with mud in my shoes but the medal in hand. I stood out on my porch, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, filming a short clip of the infamous pond spot. It was completely dry, of course. No water, no frogs, no ducks, no threat to the ecosystem. Just a slightly darker patch of grass and a shadow that moved with the wind. I posted it with a caption, "Still no lifeguard, still no pond." The video blew up in the local community Facebook group within hours. It was shared, joked about, meme day, and even featured in a local radio segment titled "Karen versus the Dirt Hole." Turns out I wasn't the only one tired of her antics. That's when the calls started coming in. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before started showing up, some with cookies, others just wanting to say, "Good for you." One man told me Karen once reported him for having a hammock that looked too relaxed for the tone of the neighborhood. A woman shared how she was fined for her mailbox being too whimsical. Suddenly it was like everyone had a Karen story, and now they all had someone who finally stood up to her and won. A few of them decided it was time to take action, not against me, but against her. Even though my house sat just outside of HOA jurisdiction, most of them weren't so lucky. They were stuck under her rule, and they were tired of walking on eggshells every time. They painted their shutters or planted flowers that didn't match the neighborhood palette. By the next HOA meeting, word had spread. Karen walked into the room expecting to be the authority figure she'd always seen herself as. But this time, the seats were full, the air was thick, and the neighbors were waiting. They didn't yell, they didn't attack. They asked questions, calm, pointed, and public questions. Why did the HOA spend over $3,000 on a lawsuit with no merit? Why was Karen making executive decisions without board votes? Why had she trespassed on multiple properties under the excuse of visual inspections? Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as she tried to control the conversation, but her charm had worn thin. One by one, board members began to vote. They motioned for her removal as HOA president, citing misuse of funds, abuse of power, and harassment. She tried to interrupt, declared it illegal, even threatened to sue the board. But her voice was shaky, her arguments weak. When the final vote passed, she stormed out of the building with a dramatic flap of her oversized folder. Her reign finally over. Back at my place, life returned to what it was supposed to be: quiet, peaceful, simple. I started fixing up the barn again, brought in a few goats for fun. Even built a raised garden bed where the pond once haunted Karen's imagination. I made a wooden sign and staked it right at the edge of the shallow dip. "Welcome to Pond Zero, EST never." It got a laugh from every neighbor who visited. The funniest part, that dip dried up for good not long after. The season shifted, rainfall, that dropped, and the land flattened out naturally. Whatever tiny puddle had started all this, it gave up trying to exist, probably out of pure exhaustion from being blamed for war crimes. Karen, from what I heard, tried to file an appeal, but it was rejected almost instantly. Her credibility was gone. The sheriff's report, the court's dismissal, and her strange obsession had disqualified her from having any real influence anymore. Some say she moved away. Others say she just keeps to herself now. Her yard eerily perfect but quiet. I've seen her in months, and honestly, that's exactly the way I want it. But the story didn't end with just me and Karen. Something bigger happened in the wake of it. The neighborhood changed. People stopped whispering about problems and started talking about them. They organized new elections, rewrote the HOA rules with actual input from residents, and even formed a community BBQ committee. I was invited, even though I was outside the border. They called me the pond guy. I didn't mind. I brought lemonade and a printout of the court ruling, laminated for fun. It hung under the gazebo like a trophy. What started as an annoying feud became a strange little legacy, proof that standing your ground, even over something as silly as dry grass, can ripple farther than you ever expect. So now, every time I step into my backyard and see that slightly sunken patch of earth, I smile. Not because I'm proud of the fight, but because I didn't let nonsense win. That ground, once the center of a ridiculous legal war, is now just ground. It grows grass, hosts the occasional bird, and reminds me that some battles aren't about who's right, they're about standing up when it's easier to stay quiet. Sometimes, all it takes to drain the nonsense is a single person who refuses to sink. If you enjoyed this crazy true story, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more jaw-dropping stories you won't believe are real.